So how did you figure out all of this in, I think you said year 4, year 5 type of thing, where you started doing the videos? Like, was that an inspiration? Did you take some training?
After I got out of the hospital, literally within a few weeks, I started a landscape business course. Like, I literally remember exactly where I was typing in landscape business course into Google, and there was nothing. Like, there were some really good diplomas from like different schools around horticulture or landscape architecture, etc., but like nothing around business. And so I called it landscape business course, and I just started recording everything I was changing in the business. Being in the hospital for a couple of weeks, not being able to work, and stepping away from your business for the first time in several years, you start to see all the problems. Like, the best way to see all the problems in a business is just don't be there for a few days. And sure enough, like, oh, scheduling is messed up and routing is messed up and my pricing is messed up and the way I do my estimates is messed up. Just trying to create a system for all these different parts of a business.
I'm Garrett Wong, and this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you? Mike, welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Garrett. I appreciate you having me on.
No, absolutely. This is going to be a super exciting episode, as we were saying in the green room. I can't wait to dig into some of this. But let's back up and maybe introduce your background a little bit to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started mowing grass when I was 11 years old. And I did that because I was going to go to college early and become a doctor. And so I started college when I was 13 years old, finished my pre-med, was on my way to go to medical school. Went to Africa for a couple months and did volunteering in orphanages and clinics there. Came back to the US, realized this system wasn't really what I wanted to do in terms of medicine. And I didn't want to do the same 4 or 5 surgical procedures for the rest of my career. And so that's when I decided just to go right back to lawn care, started Augusta Lawn Care, and went full time with it. And fast forward 10 years, we now have franchised the business. We did that 5 years ago, but now we have 155 locations around the world. And we also have started software and other elements to be able to support other home service businesses. And that's been kind of the journey.
Wow. I am going to back up there. Did you say college at 13?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. You got to tell the audience about that. Like, what am I dealing with here? Some kind of phenom genius? How did that happen? And what was that like?
Yeah. So I skipped a couple grades early on, but really my brother was 2 years ahead of me. And so he did homeschool for the first couple years. And I was just sat there and learned everything with him, even though I was 3 and 4. And so once I got to grade school, it came pretty easily because I'd already learned a lot of it and kind of fell into teacher mode for most of my peers. So it actually helped me a lot, I feel like, even now, in terms of being able to teach, being able to communicate, because I had to do that for the rest of my team or my peers back in grade school. I skipped a few grades, kind of going through grade school, and then did a couple years at home where I could consolidate all my high school years in just a couple years. But yeah, that was kind of the how I did it.
Wow. So when you said you went to Africa, how old were you?
So that was right after I turned 18 years old, and it was right before I was supposed to go to medical school. And so I had, taken the MCAT, gotten everything ready to go for medical school, and then took that trip. And it was transformative, like basically 6 weeks of intense, like we did injections and births and surgeries, and I worked a lot in the pediatric burn unit. And so it was phenomenal, but I would see 40 to 60 patients a day. And I came over here back to the US, and like a lot of it was paperwork. I felt like I was going to be constrained to this one very specific discipline of surgery that I liked, which was great. But ultimately, I didn't want to spend the next 10 years in residency and fellowships and going into massive amounts of debt. So ultimately, to your point, I let a lot of people down at that point because I was the guy that was going to go to school really young, be the Doogie Howser situation. And so going and cutting grass wasn't exactly on their agenda. My parents were never pushing that agenda, but professors, peers, their expectations were high. And so, went back to mowing grass, and it turned out. But years 3, 4, and 5, when you have very little evidence of success, it's very difficult to be confident in that decision when the business isn't making money. You feel like you're spinning your wheels. And I can really relate to a lot of people that feel that same exact way throughout their entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, no, I know we just met, but my listeners know that my story was I was actually in the 5th year of my PhD, ready to defend, take my candidacy exam, and then I dropped out. My story was because I bought a rental property and I just couldn't see myself going through that whole thing, maybe getting an MBA, working big pharma. But you're right, that whole, my parents were disappointed. My mom supported me. My dad supported me, but I mean, he really wanted me to be, that Dr. Wong type of thing. So it's difficult. And then as all that self-doubt as you're going through it, I mean, tell us about the early years in the grass cutting.
Yeah, so what's funny is I'm actually allergic to grass. So during the springtime for about 6 to 8 weeks usually, I would have 3 to 4 shirts that I would wear throughout the day because I would just get hives all over my chest, my throat would constrict, my eyes would get all puffy, so, like, there's a couple times where I have to stop working 'cause I just couldn't see. Um, so that was a little interesting, but the first few years, it was like, big leverage or big step up was when you go full time. So I kinda started off part-time, I was doing personal training at a gym, Anytime Fitness. And then the second year, I went full time. So I was growing really fast. Didn't know what I was doing necessarily in terms of running a business, hiring. It's like my first person I hired that wasn't a friend. They ended up suing me on their way out the door, and I had to settle with them outside of court because I had no idea what I was doing in terms of hiring or marketing. So I was, fortunate enough to be very early on in terms of Facebook ads, and they're a great deal. But even still, like I didn't know how to convert and do close ratio and like understand these elements. So I was shooting in the dark. And so really once about the fourth year in the business is when I was underneath a dump truck turning on the PTO and the PTO line got caught in my hoodie. And so if anyone ever wants to
What's a
see something,
PTO?
power takeoff, it's basically the thing that spins underneath a dump truck that powers the entire dump bed. And
Okay.
so if you wanna see some, gruesome videos, go on YouTube and just put in PTO accidents, and you'll get your full share. A lot of times it will take people's arms or just kill them because you just get caught up in it, and it will not stop. And so, I got caught in it. I thought I was gonna die in this split second. All my sweater, my undershirt, and my t-shirt bunched around my neck and just squeezed. Fortunately, it just went to smithereens, just burst, and I fell out of the PTO. And so at that point in time, though, I realized over the course of a couple of weeks in the hospital that my business was not built on systems. It was built on me. And so I'm literally in the hospital and I am FaceTiming my crew, giving them instructions on the next project. And so I determined that once I came out of that, I was going to show the roadmap of what I have to do to change the business. And so whether it be paying employees based on performance or making estimate videos, so I didn't have to be there on site with the crew. These are all things that came out as a result of realizing my business was worth nothing. It was built upon me working 80, 100 hours a week. And that's when I started making videos and content. And that's really why we started the franchise, is to be able to give the systems and actually have skin in the game with the owners that are building their business.
So what was the operation like? Take us through years one, two, three, and four, just because I mean, I'm an entrepreneur and there's lots of people that are out there. There's a stat. I just got back from a conference last week, but a stat that keeps kicking around in my mind is that like there's millions and millions of businesses, but something like over 80% of them only have one employee, the owner. So tell us about that first employee, that decision to hire. What was it like? How did you expand? What were they doing versus you?
Yeah, so the very first year I was only part-time. I only did $30,000 a year in that first year for Augusta. I was working part-time, and Anytime Fitness also started. I went to night school for my MBA. And so the second year, though, I went full-time, and within a month or 2 of me going full-time, I was like, "I also need an employee." Like, leads were starting to come in, work was starting to come in, and I definitely wanted to just grow this thing. I had poured myself so much into education, like memorizing textbooks. I was the guy with the skeletons and the muscle diagrams on the wall, and, like, that's all I poured myself into. And so I did the exact same thing with business, just whether it be the MBA course or all day long listening to podcasts and books. It was, like, all I thought about. And so when we started growing, I got the first employee. That was basically a friend, and that it got me to 200,000 the second year, and then it went 200,000, then 470, and then I think it was 780 in the fourth year. And so that was like substantial growth, but I did it wrong. Like I added more and more services. I bought way too much equipment. I wasn't tracking efficiency of the crew, and so I did everything wrong. And unfortunately, most people in my case, like I didn't have a family. I didn't have dependents. I was able to skate by without taking much, if anything, out of the business. For a lot of people, those first 3, 4, 5 years while you're trying to figure things out, you have to be paying the bills, and I can only imagine the stress that would have because I was stressed out just by myself. I don't have kids and a family, and like so, I really sympathize for the small business owner that's trying to figure it out because in those first few years, I was a ship without a rudder.
Well, growth is not necessarily the answer to everything, right? And top line revenue doesn't mean anything if the P&L is terrible. I heard a quote at this business conference. I think it was from Adam Coffey. And he said, before you scale, you must optimize the business, right? And what I tell my employees, just to really try to hammer it home, it's like, okay, what's 10 times zero? And they're like, zero. I'm like, what's 100 times zero? Uh, Zero. Exactly. So if you're trying to grow on a system that is not optimized, it's just going to break. You're just accelerating and magnifying all of those mistakes. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and as you scale, like I always say that growth sucks cash and growth creates chaos.
Right.
And so if you have a system by which you are sucking cash, i.e. negative cash flow, and you're creating more and more chaos, that's a great recipe to want to quit. And that's why so many small businesses do. And so I think a lot of times it's good advice for someone to take a year, like, let's not grow the business. Like, wild idea. Let's not grow the business, not do any marketing, not hire more people, and just optimize what we currently have. Because I happen to feel like if you did that for a year, you'd wake up being refreshed, you're more profitable, more cushion in the bank account, and you'd be re-energized to go to that next level of growth down the road.
So how did you figure out all of this in yeah, I think you said year 4, year 5 type of thing where you started doing the videos? Like, was that an inspiration? Did you take some training?
So after I got out of the hospital, literally within a few weeks, I started a landscape business course. And the reason I called it that was because I remember typing when I first started Augusta several years prior. Like, I literally remember exactly where I was typing in landscape business course into Google, and there was nothing. Like, there was some really good diplomas from like different schools around horticulture or landscape architecture, etc., but like nothing around business. And so I called it landscape business course, and I just started recording everything I was changing in the business. Because when you have something like me, feeling like I was about to die, being in the hospital for a couple weeks, not being able to work, and stepping away from your business for the first time in several years, you start to see all the problems. Like, the best way to see all the problems in a business is just don't be there for a few days
Yeah,
and see
go away.
what hits the fan. And sure enough, like, oh, scheduling is messed up and routing is messed up and my pricing is messed up and my way I do my estimates is messed up. And so just trying to create a system for all these different parts of a business. And I always like to think about, like, how do like a system is essentially, how do I take a series of inputs and create predictable outputs where every single time the output is the same. So whether it be a system for phone calls or a system for sending out estimates or a system for sales, what is the system? And like everyone's like, oh, system, this. And so I had to like, what does the system really do? Like, number one, simplify. Number two, standardize. What's the opposite of those things? Complex and custom. And so I just avoided anything that had to do with custom work. I avoided anything that was complex or hard, or I needed a whole bunch of training around. And I just focused on things that are simple or things that I could standardize and do the same way every single time to be able to get the predictable result of a closed job, a happy customer, a 5-star review. These are all things like I want to create a predictable result in the business. And to do that, I need a system.
So do you think there's a balance between having too many systems and processes? And I'll before you answer that, I'll give some context to the question because in our property management company, I mean, I just told you I'm an ex-scientist, and I worked in a pharmaceutical company for a couple of years, developing standard operating procedures. So I mean, you almost have to have a well, you not almost, you do have to have a procedure on how to clean a counter before prepare that product, or the FDA is going to go, well, the counter wasn't clean. We can't pass this. You actually need an SOP on how to write an SOP. So that's kind of where I started in the management company. And I literally have like well over 1,000 training manuals and SOPs, but they became very unwieldy. So much to the point that my staff stopped looking at them, or they would be like, "Hey, Garrett, this is a better way of doing this. What do you think?" I'm like, "That's great. Now we have an obsolete SOP." What's your take on that?
Yeah. So a few things. I think a lot of times we do think as I kind of think of like three different stages of growing a business. The first one is your labor, specifically in home services, but even in like something like real estate, you're the one pounding on the doors. You're the one closing the deals, handshakes, like like making everything happen. The second stage is manager. That's when you get your first few employees. Your main role is that of a manager. And then as you begin to scale, you usually pass the $1 million in revenue. That's when you become an architect. You step away from the business. You have managers in the business. You have laborers in the business doing the work. And so, one of the things I think a lot of times I see smaller business owners doing is they should be a labor based upon their revenue. They're doing $100,000 in annual revenue, But they're trying to think like an entrepreneur. They're trying to think like an architect, someone that's like stepping away and creating systems and SOPs. And like, look, wait, you're supposed to be focused on being a labor. Or they get their first couple employees and they're doing the same thing. They're going to conferences and figuring out all these, 5-year plans and projections and acquisitions. Like, whoa, whoa, you have 3 employees. You should be focused on being a great manager and not focus on the SOPs and like getting everything dialed in. By the time you grow the business to a certain size where it actually makes sense to create SOPs, it should actually have enough redundancy where like it doesn't change all the time. You're not pivoting, you're not changing your product mix, you're not changing your service mix all the time. I would also say when we actually started creating the SOPs and the systems, what we try to do is break it down into such component parts to where if something does change in the system, I can pull out one part and slide another one in. And so trying to make it as interchangeable as possible so that inevitably things will change as you scale. The biggest way I've seen this actually happen is in our command center. So all the franchisees, we answer their phones, we do their invoicing, estimates, like everything admin related you do for them. Well, we have 23 departments. There's a whole bunch of moving parts. You have lots of people in office, outside of office, different levels of training, etc. And so tons of SOPs for every single department. There's just tons of SOPs. You change one thing in the business and almost every department gets affected. Every SOP needs to be changed. Every training manual needs to be changed. And so how do we break down as many component parts for that training so that when we change one part, we just pull out one piece? And usually what I like to use is video. I'm a huge fan of video over text. It's easier for us to make it interchangeable with AI. We can scrape the entire transcript so we know when that word was mentioned. So if we do need to change something, we can pull it out and put something else in that's new. But it's kind of like X's and O's of that process.
Okay. Wow. Do you So what about compliance? How do you know that somebody has read it, trained on it? I know, at least in pharma, we would have to sign that we read and understood that version. Do you do anything similar to that?
Yeah, like it kind of depends on your industry. So for some parts where you're handling whether it be medical data or financial data, there's a level of actually like legal requirements. So I would put that caveat to it. When it's a matter of having someone that needs to be proficient in a certain SOP or system in order to be able to get the predictable result, I'm just going to test it. So I'm going to put you on a phone call. I'm going to put you on 5 follow-up phone calls. I'm going to put you on 5 estimates, and I'm going to track it. And whether it be scripts, like I'm not going to measure whether or not the job closed. I'm going to measure whether or not you smiled, whether or not you started with your name, and like, did you follow the script? And so the closer I can get the dependencies of human nature out of the system, the better. And then I just have to test against that measurement.
Okay, that makes sense. Speak to me about the early days. So if I understand correctly, you've got this uh, growing business. You get into video. You start standardizing things. At what point did the light bulb go off and say, we have a franchisable product here, we're going to expand in that direction?
Yeah, so it actually happened a little different. So I started landscape business course, started a little bit of like digital media and content, trying to help other landscapers that I felt were in the same situation as me, having a business that basically ran them. They worked crazy hours, didn't see anything for it. And what I noticed is, especially when I started pay for performance, where it's basically a way to pay my employees based upon how hard they work and not just their hourly rate. Once I came up with that and developed that and started sharing with people, I realized that like no one was doing it. And they were like, that's a great idea. That's awesome. But no one did it. And in part it was because they looked at me like as a consultant, someone outside their business, almost a competitor, because like I was in the lawn care industry as well. And so I figured, look, the only way for me to be able to actually make a change in this industry and help the industry that has helped me so much and is literally to do a franchise where I have skin in the game. And when I say something, it's not because I am against them. It's not because I think I'm smart. It's because I am part of their brand, and we have a vested interest in growing their business. And so we started the franchise, and to reinforce that, I didn't want to do a royalty. I didn't want it to be where I told you, here's how you grow revenue. You immediately think as a franchisee, well, he's saying that because if I go get a salesperson, I'll increase top line revenue and he'll get more money on royalties. And so he's like, hey, we're gonna have a flat monthly fee. I don't care if you do 5 million in revenue or $500,000 in annual revenue. You're just gonna pay $1,200 a month. And so we've done that from the beginning because I want it to be when I talk about a system, there's adherence because they know the only obligation or the only uh, the real incentive that I have is for them to stay in business. And that was really the focus from that is like I didn't see people adhering the systems. I was very disappointed that I wasn't making an impact. And I figured, look, if we can change this industry if we get 1,000 locations all pulling in the same direction, and each of their markets, their competitors have to match us because the competitor starts to expect that their phone call gets answered 24/7. They start to expect that people show up in uniforms and a truck that's painted. Like they start to expect that they get text messages and emails and a card on file. And that's really what I want to change with this lawn care industry specifically. It's just like the level of professionalism is just pretty abhorrent.
So you mentioned, Mike, that your I guess corporate office handles phone calls as well. Can you break that down for the listeners? Because I'm not quite sure I understand what the role of the franchisee is then.
Yeah. So I look at a business as three different functions, right? You have sales, you have admin, and you have operations. And
Okay.
so if you think about any business or a franchise as a system, I want to make sure that I have a predictable result, as with any system is. My goal is to be able to make print profitable small businesses. So if that is the model, I need to be able to create a system for sales, admin, and operations. So from a sales perspective, we try to automate the actual sale. On our website, people can sign up, get their card and file, we check out, good to go. It doesn't require great sales ability. You don't need to be able to be a smooth talker, a great estimator, or tons of experience in the field. We have systematized that. The other aspect is admin, and that's the part we built the command center around, is all the little things that most entrepreneurs hate doing, paperwork, payroll, estimating, sending us payments, all of that stuff, we wanna take off their plate. Again, we're trying to create a system by which we take 0 and we get them to $800,000 in annual revenue over the course of 5 years. That's the goal. And so the only other aspect, and this is the challenging part with our industry, and down the road, I'll address this with software, but, like, the third part is operations. That's the most difficult part, and I want my owners to and their general managers to be as focused on that as possible. That is their team, their training, their onboarding, their hiring, their firing. That's what I want them to be focused on 98% of their day. I don't want them to think about sales. I don't want them to think about admin. And so that's really why the command center was built, is to take that function off of their plate so they can focus on the thing that actually moves the needle, which is their team. Because if they can do that, the other two elements of the business are taken care of, and then we can have a predictable outcome in terms of a system.
It's interesting, because I think in most franchises, and I mean, I say most, I have no idea, but from what I've seen anecdotally in my, career, it seems like franchises, you've got your fees, whatever model, pick your flavor, but then it's really up to that small business to do everything. You can piece out things like national marketing strategies and things like that, but it seems like business development is left up to that franchise. Why did you decide that versus letting everybody kind of just do their own?
So when it comes to like marketing, I'm a big believer in them doing the marketing. We give them the tools, the training, the creative, the
Okay.
text, etc. I feel like also I'm a franchisee at Anytime Fitness, so I own a club. I know I spend every month on a national campaign. I know I spend it on my local campaigns, and 98% of people walking through that door mention my local campaigns. So I'm not a fan of taking like the collective marketing and using it on a national level. When it comes to the business ops and strategy or even things like admin, trying to streamline that, I look at why does a business fail, and I'm simply asking, can we somehow solve that? And so there's a few reasons why I see home service business fail. The first off is people get bogged down, they get discouraged, and they end up quitting. That's a lot around admin. Like most people in home services, they enjoy the work, they like being outside, they don't mind working with their hands. The work itself doesn't get to them. And so it's a matter of the admin side. So we've tried to solve that with Command Center. And then the biggest thing that I actually think for all home services in terms of why they quit is because of the seasonality. You have 2, 3, 5, 6 months out of the year where your revenues drop, your profits go negative, leads drop. It's horrible. And so how do we solve that problem? So we've started Augusta Lights, like where we literally have a whole different brand for all the franchisees to do Christmas lights during their off season. So it's always like if you're trying to create a system and you're trying to create predictable outcomes, like, well, where did we go wrong? Like, where did someone have to quit? Where did someone fail? And I'm going to identify why, and I'm going to try to fix it. And so whether it be admin, whether it be Q4 collapse or what we call the off season, or if it is any area, if it's like, oh, they can't sell. Okay, well, they can't sell. I'm going to automate it. I'm going to have I'm going to have AI. I'm going to have website forms to be able to do as much of the sales as possible. So I take that out as a variable in terms of the system funneling then down to this outcome that I want.
Okay. So basically, the franchisee has to basically hunt for their own leads, but they feed them into the system. Then your admin, your center your command center just takes all of that, and then the work gets pieced up back out. It kind of comes in and then back out to that original franchisee. Is that correct?
Correct. You got it. And they all have their own individual accounts. They own their customers. So if someone ever did want to leave, they would keep their customers. So we don't hold them hostage to that. They don't have, there's no cost to even leaving. So like if we don't provide the value on a monthly basis, they can walk away. And so ultimately, even to your point, what you just mentioned there, the getting of the leads, we've given them a lot of frameworks, but we've got a lot of feedback in the past 12 months. Like, hey, we just want you to do it for us. And so one of the things we're working on right now, again, is like, even though you give someone all of the tools, sometimes they won't go do it and they're not getting leads. And so like, well, what do I do now? I don't have any mechanism to actually go get advertising in front of their market and drive leads them. We don't have a marketing fund. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to fix. It's like, okay, if you want us to, completely optional, we will do your advertising. And then based upon a cost per lead structure without any management fee, I can predict exactly what you'll have to spend in order to ramp a location to X amount in revenue. And so we're just trying to take all these variables out that otherwise become red herrings, or all of a sudden they didn't know something and they get into a market, oh, door hangers don't work, or Facebook ads don't work, or something. And these are the reasons why they fail. And so I'm just trying to remove all those little holes that in that funnel, in that system, people fall out of.
Okay. So tell me about the territories and how you split that out. I mean, the information I have on my side screen here is 150 locations. It might even be more than that at the time of this recording. How are you splitting up territories? Are you allowing more than one per city? How does that work?
Yeah, so we basically make sure that at least 100,000 people inside. Our goal is to build each location to 800,000 in annual revenue. Our goal on that is 20%, or sorry, $200,000 in net profit on an $800,000 revenue business. We
Nice.
believe you can easily do that using simple services at less than 100,000 people. Some of our most successful locations are more on that 30 to 50,000 person level. I started my very first location in Blaine, Washington, 7,000 people. So it's not about the size of the market, but we make sure there's at least 100,000 people inside the territory. And so usually it's a 3 to 5 mile radius around a given address, and then they focus on that territory.
Okay. Okay. And then um, speak to me about the P4P concept. I did read about it. I'd love to hear more about it. I believe you call it your pay per performance model.
Yeah, exactly. So P4P is pay for performance. Essentially, it's one of those things where I wanted to do it for a long time. I told my crew, like, man, I just wish there was a way I could pay everyone based upon what they actually produced instead of just how long they clocked in. And over the course of time, kind of refined the system and then create software around it, create the book around it. And essentially, it's like, hey, you get a percentage of all the labor revenue that you earn for the business. That's it. And a lot of times when you say that to an owner, like, well, they're going to go really fast and do a lousy job. Okay, great. So we have yellow slips. Yellow slips are callbacks. They're damage cases. They're things that the customer is unhappy about to maintain quality. But then there's also other things like there's times that have them in shop work. There's times that there's one person that's really experienced in the crew and someone who's less experienced. So all these different variables, we just have to iron out every single one in terms of like, how does the system actually work so it could actually be used? What happens if you have someone who can operate an excavator and someone else who pulls weeds on the same project? How do you differentiate that? And so that was really the model for it. But it came as a result of I remember someone, actually Brad is his name. He now works for me as my CPA. But way back, he was mowing grass out in the field, and then he would do his CPA stuff on the side. And I remember him coming and asking for a raise. And I knew he deserved it. I knew that he worked crazy hard, but I had to say no because I couldn't afford it at the time. And so literally, he didn't get a raise because he asked for it at the wrong time. Meanwhile, there are people that are making $2-3 more an hour than him that didn't work as hard, weren't there as long, didn't put as much effort, didn't care about the company as much, but I could not afford. So it was like a breaking point. I'm like, well, you're switching this new model thing. And it's like, if you work hard, you'll make more money because you get a percentage of all the labor revenue. And I just don't think it's fair, especially in home services, where there's someone that has been around for 15 years. They sit in the truck, they take naps, they stop at every single gas station, take 48 smoke breaks. They make the company almost nothing, and they somehow make more money than the person who's maybe only 2 weeks on the job, but is hustling. They pack a lunch, they don't stop throughout the day. They're trying to do as much work as possible. It just doesn't make any sense that the first person makes more money. And so it's a meritocracy by which the harder you work, the more money you make.
Okay. So is there like a base plus some kind of verifiable bonus based on a KPI or a metric?
Exactly. So essentially, all throughout the day, we are tracking still their clocked hours. We're making sure they get paid a base pay. They cannot make less than that, no matter how low their performance is, no matter how many yellow slips they have. But then we're also tracking a certain percentage of the labor revenue that they bring to the business. And at the end of the pay period, whichever of those two is higher, base pay plus overtime, or your P for P, they're going to get a paycheck for that. Whichever of those two is higher.
And you're doing this for every single franchisee. You're tracking all of that for them.
Yeah, so the software, like P4P in general, is available to everyone. But we at Command Center do actually track it for them, send out daily reports. So every single day, the employee gets a report of their performance. Here's what you made on base pay. Here's what you made on P4P. Here's why we have like kind of the AI side that kind of breaks down why how they could perform better, etc. And then the manager gets the same thing. They get, hey, here's your top performers. Here's how much their efficiency score is. It kind of breaks it all down. They get a daily report on it.
And is P4P something that you guys developed, or is that like kind of an industry standard out there?
It's definitely not industry standard, unfortunately. That's my goal. But like, we developed it, but it's not like anything revolutionary. It's basically commission. It's piecemeal. It is, you could like, there's lots of other names for it. It was a matter of like, how do we take all these variables that people don't switch to commission for? They don't switch to these other models. Like it's very common in the mechanic world, in terms of like you get paid based on the job, the employees. So they're used of this. It's not industry standard. I would love to make it so. And in my opinion, the way to do that is have 1,000 locations of Augusta, and then employees in those markets start to expect it because they know they can get paid significantly more if they're a top performer.
Okay. So speak to me about, again, early days trying to get this franchise model off the ground. What did that look like? What were the struggles?
Yeah, like everyone wants to start a franchise. It seems super easy. It's the hardest thing in the world. Especially when you go into the franchise like we did and we said, hey, look, you can leave at any time with no fee. That's like a tough proposition
Why did you do that though?
because I wanted to make a franchise that I would sign into. Like, how do I make this where I would sign the franchise agreement? Is really the
Got
bottom
it.
line. And I was like,
Okay.
well, first off, I'd like to leave any time with no penalty. I would like to have a flat monthly fee, and I would like to leave at any time and keep my customers. And so that's what we did. And you know, it's worked out well. Like less than 1% of people have left and still operate their business. And to my knowledge, actually don't know of any. I know a couple did, and then they might not be in business. Actually, I do know one. I know one person to date that has left Augusta and still operates their lawn care and landscaping business. Um, and so it's a matter of, yeah, it's a lot of pressure, but like there's a lot of scummy franchisors out there. Last year, there was over 400 franchisors that were started. That is they started signing their legal docs. They're considered a franchisor. The vast majority of them will never get past 10 locations. And if you look at all the research, most of the time you need over 100 locations to become profitable. And so if someone is saying like, oh, I'm going to become a franchisor, realize that you will likely, the likelihood of failure as a franchisor is extremely high. And so this is why the franchise world gets such a bad rap, is so many of them fail, and then all the franchisees underneath them get burned. And so I would say to anyone that wants to start a franchise is like, you better have a very clear path to 100 locations and the funding to do that. And then I'll also say is like, why would someone join if there's not a very clear value proposition instead of just like, well, it's a good brand or we give them leads. It is not good enough. You need to be able to solve their problems. You need to actually care. You need to be able to training for their crew. You need to be able to create a business that runs without them based upon the systems you've created. And then you might have somewhat of a model. And then you got to realize you will recreate the franchise system at 10, 50, and 100 locations. And I can't speak beyond that. I would imagine though at 500, we'll have to do the same thing. And that takes an enormous amount of effort. And for the vast majority of franchisors, they would be better off in their first 3 to 5 years of being a franchisor. They'd be better off if they just started 3, 4, 5 more new locations themselves. there'd be less pressure, they'd be profitable, they would make more money, they'd more revenue, they wouldn't have to go through this evolution of changing the business model. And so I put it as a cautionary tale. When I say it, people think that I'm saying it because I did it, and now it's like you know, cool of me to say how hard it is. Just look at the math. The vast majority, like out of 400 that started last year, one or two will make it past 100 locations. And so the likelihood of failure is extremely high.
Okay. So what's the long-term vision? I mean, you mentioned Washington, you mentioned the US. Are you just trying to like how many are you what's your goal if we were to look at a map? Is it even expanding outside of the US? Anywhere that has grass?
Yeah, so we just started our first location in Australia.
Nice.
We have about 15 locations up in Canada, but we want to get it to 1,000 locations. I think if I would do that, we'd have enough market penetration that all the competition in each market would know about us. Then they start to list like when we move into a market because we have pay for performance. I also have Copilot CRM, and so I can actually and lawn care web design and stuff like that. It's like we have these ancillary services that we've pieced out, and so when we go into a new market with Augusta, I can tell that in that market, we get people signing up for a new website. We get people signing up for pay for performance software, getting a CRM at Copilot. And so if the general direction is how do I change this industry? What I've come to learn is like I need to compete with everyone. Because once I start competing with them, they start to pay attention. And so I say that everyone gets a little ticked off. I don't mean it maliciously. I don't want people to fail. It's just more a matter of I want the industry to change. I want it to improve, and I've just come to realize that creating content alone does not move anything. It is a matter of how do I compete with these people so they actually start to focus on these systems and hopefully build the business and then change the expectation of the customer.
So you're talking about a bigger picture than just Augusta, because when you say you want other operators in those different new regions to notice you, what are you talking about here? Do you want them to notice that, hey, there's a new player here, and therefore they're threatened, and therefore they have to step up their game?
Yeah, ultimately, it's kinda like what Amazon did to online e-commerce. It was a matter of, you know, 20 years ago, we didn't expect two-day shipping. We didn't expect free delivery. We didn't expect massive amounts of variety. We didn't expect the best prices. And so, the reason that we now all expect that from Walmart and every other retailer is because Amazon changed the expectation of the customer. And so our goal with the size and when we move into a market is people start to expect things to be different when they call their landscaper. They don't put up with someone asking for a check underneath their front doormat. Like that's why this industry has such low standards. And so we want to change that, and it's definitely beyond just the franchise. Like I really think that robotics will take this industry over in 15 to 20 years. And so who will be positioned best for that in my opinion is a person that has software and distribution. And so there's a lot of really good technology around robotics right now for lawn care industry specifically, but a lot of these startups run out of money or they don't really get anywhere because they don't have distribution. And so I think if I can get 700 to 1,000 locations for Augusta, I'll have the distribution. I'll have the command center to be able to operate the robotics from a remote perspective without having to have my own engineers, et cetera. And then with Copilot and P4P software, that's going to allow me to have the infrastructure from a software perspective to make sure it's all actually being run correctly. And so we can build that over the next 15 years or so. We want to take it public. And then I think we'll be in a good spot to then have the capital to invest in the robotic side. And then that's when I think, it'll become a little bit more mainstream.
So I was actually going to ask you about the future of the industry. So it's interesting you mentioned robotics. Speak to us just a little bit about that. Give us a little bit of a teaser. Like, what are we talking about? Some Roombas that are going around and going on the lawns and cutting everything completely automated? Do you have to drop these things off? Are they traveling there? Like, what do you see or envision?
Yeah, like right now, there's a model around that, like, and that is dropping off the Roomba style mowers, and some people have made a business into it. There's a lot of difficulties with it from a financing perspective of how many you would need to actually have 500 or 1,000 mowing customers in a market. You need literally thousands of these pieces. It's very cost prohibitive. So, in my opinion, when you can strap on a piece of technology for 10 or 20 grand onto an existing mower, and it now has lidar or cameras, has sensors to be able to do the equivalent of what a real human being does, then I can send a robot and one person do the string trimming and blowing off. I can send them together, and instead of sending two people, I send one. Now all of a sudden, the unit economics make a lot more sense. The homeowner's not going to be able to afford the $10,000. They're not also going to afford the $10,000 mower itself. So it'll be much more commercially driven than what right now is like a 15 or $2,000, Roomba that you put out in your mower or on your lawn that a homeowner would buy. And so I think once it becomes economically feasible for the contractor to be able to replace a worker, that's when it'll take off. And so the tech is there. The cost is extremely prohibitive though. There's a lot of this technology that actually works great. And there's actually mostly just two constraints: cost and then regulation. There's a lot of regulation around having a large scale commercial size mower in operation without line of sight, without someone actually seeing the mower, having a controller, having a fail safe on it. And so I think over the course of time, especially as regulators have to warm up to self-driving cars, that eventually it'll trickle down to where we have a lot more autonomy to be able to use the robotics.
Well, it's interesting because so I have a 20-year-old. He's been cutting grass for a couple years, and he tells me the stories, right? A class, C class, or B class, C class properties, and of course, everybody wants to cut the A class property. But in the C class neighborhoods, I mean, they're running over bottles and rocks and needles, baby toys. Um, I mean, regulations. Do you really think that they're going to allow, what if there's a baby that's sitting in the middle of the lawn or a chihuahua or something where, it's going to get chewed up? Like, not to be gruesome on a podcast, but it could happen, could it not?
Absolutely, and that's why right now there is so much regulation around it. I would say though, as we have now started to regulate 5,000-pound vehicles traveling at 80 miles an hour down the street, we will eventually figure out how to get a mower that travels 8 miles an hour with blades that are spinning. Yes, could kill somebody the same way a Tesla could right now. And so I
Yeah,
think
that's
it'll just be
fair.
a matter of time, and then we kind of trickle down eventually. But I don't think we're ready for it's not ready for prime time now. There's no one that has the distribution. The software is not ready for it. I'm actually going out next month to a really awesome facility where they have a commercially viable product for this, but they can't distribute these for without spending tens of thousands of dollars. No one's going to buy one. They work relatively well. You can try to replace at least one of your workers on every crew. But until it makes economic sense, until there's regulation that is removed, like right now for that operation, they have to have engineers that will then, on the beginning of every single visit, they call into the office, and their office is engineers that are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year because that's the level of technological abilities required to simply map out a property. And so this is the type of stuff that will take a long time to work out. It's not going to be the next couple years. Everyone's been saying it's going to be in a couple years from now. We're on the verge for a long time. It's going to be 15 to 20 years from now. And I just want to be in the position to, when that happens, we have the capital, we have the distribution, we have the software to actually make it work.
Okay, very cool. So I'm going to allow you to kind of give a bit of a pitch for 30 seconds here. I mean, we're obviously wanting to help you promote your business as well. What should people do if they want to get into an Augusta franchise?
Yeah, I don't think a franchise is for everyone. I talk a lot about who should and who should not join. If you're super entrepreneurial and you kind of like testing things out, you kind of like trial and error, you don't mind figuring things out, you like your own brand, franchising is probably not for you. If you kind of like having your hands on all aspects of the business, sales, admin, and operations, you like tinkering with the system, franchising is not for you. You get a franchise to where you reduce as many of the variables as possible because someone else has done it hundreds of times and remove them from the system. Like you cannot do these. You must paint your truck this way. You must do your ads this way. Your website must look like this. And so constraints can be very difficult for entrepreneurs. And so I don't think that most people should become franchisees, but that when you look at the success rate of a franchisee versus an independent operator, if we all were like just mathematically driven, we'd all become franchisees. And so it's really a matter of like, what are you wanting? Are you wanting the hunt or are you wanting the result? And if you're wanting the result, I encourage anyone, regardless if you're in lawn care or whatever, join a franchise. It's like if I just have to bet on any business being successful based upon A, someone's first time doing it, or B, someone else that has done it 150 times before, or 1,000 times, or Anytime Fitness 4,000 times, I have a good hunch that I'm probably going to bet on the latter. And so it just comes down to what are you wanting from the business? And I think the business should serve us. And so if you're wanting to grow and develop your skills and learn all aspects of the marketing and which colors and split test things on your website, then go start your own brand. If you're more interested in the result of what that business brings financially, I'd probably go the franchise route.
I have a really good friend who really believes in the franchises, and I mean, home care, cleaning, like, he's just branching out into all different types of things. I would say, though, he's very, very good entrepreneur. He's just chosen to run the businesses from a very higher level,
100%.
so that he doesn't have to go into the minutia of I mean, really, who wants to they all say, "Oh, you have to really embrace the journey," but I mean, the journey sucks sometimes trying to do a startup. I mean, you're talking about a proven recipe where almost everything is done for you, and then you can just work on optimizing and just getting your feet wet, right?
Absolutely.
So, before we end, I like to ask the same question of every guest, and you're gonna be no exception. So this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you?
Yeah, so success to me is contentment. And that was framed, kind of molded in me from when I went to Africa, and there's a whole bunch of orphans there. Went to a couple of different orphanages, and these kids had nothing. Most of them were abandoned by their parents. There was a 3-bedroom house, and Margaret, the lady that ran the orphanage, she ran it independently. There was no government support in a 3-bedroom house with over 72 children from ages 0 to 18. Um, and I would give them like a soccer ball or a bottle of bubbles, and the entire day, 8, 10 hours. That would keep them preoccupied, and they were just thrilled out of their mind. They were absolutely overjoyed. And in that moment, I remember thinking and sitting back and like, oh, they're content. And if this is what contentment looks like, then you've won. And so to me, success and winning is contentment. And that means that like there's a clear distinction between contentment and just sitting back on your laurels and being complacent. And so I am content, and I would consider myself, quote, because of that, successful. But it does not mean that I am not going to try to realize my full potential, and I'm going to be complacent and just like let life go on as it is. And so to me, winning and success is I am content. And then anything in excess of that, I hope that that overflow can pour onto someone else.
Okay, well said. No, I think if to paraphrase what you just said, I mean, sure, you want to be successful, but you can never really take your eye off the ball and get complacent because everything catches up with you. Your competitors, systems will start to fray around the edges and get a little bit disjointed. So I really love that perspective. All right, so well, I guess we'll cap it there. I want to thank you for hanging out with me for the last hour, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Garrett. Appreciate it.
Awesome.